It is noon on the dot, and this is Colin Boney-Kemper speaking with HORAN, and I'm very excited to dive into our presentation today on the WAYMARK Collective, a stop-loss captive. Everyone on the line today is from an organization who is uniquely positioned to take advantage of this solution, and as we go through the presentation today, our mission is going to be to help employers find a way to leverage their collective buying power in order to better manage costs and reduce overall risk. So last year, at the end of last year, we established a team of individuals to lead this project, and I would like to take a minute to recognize a few of those people that have put in a lot of work here. First, I'd like to recognize Dominic Franchini. We'll be hearing from Dominic a little later in the presentation, but he's really relentless when it comes to challenging the status quo in the healthcare space, and he's always looking for ways to solve our industry's biggest challenges. So he's been really pivotal in bringing the solution to HORAN and to our clients. I also want to recognize Leslie Miller. She's actually a former member of HORAN who has since retired to Charleston, South Carolina, and started her own employee benefits consulting practice. And so Leslie has a really deep understanding of the captive marketplace, and her knowledge has been really invaluable in creating this WAYMARK solution. Finally, I'd like to recognize Rocco Pengallo, who has taken this concept and turned it into really a tangible solution. He's working tirelessly to bring the data to life for organizations so they can understand how this can impact what they have today in their health plan and going forward. A few housekeeping items. Please, everyone today is on listen-only mode and is muted. So we ask that if you do have questions, we encourage them. Please submit them via the Q&A feature on the WebEx. Dominic is going to be managing those questions, and we'll do our best to answer all of them at the end of the presentation. Additionally, the presentation is being recorded. We'll be happy to share it with you at the end upon request. And as you get into more specifics with your respective organizations, we encourage you to work with your HORAN account team to further the conversation. We're happy to schedule individual meetings in the weeks to come after this presentation. So let's take a quick look at the journey on where we've been and where we're headed. This project has really been a culmination of more than 6 months of market research to determine the best way to position the solution. So at the end of last year, in October 2019, we determined that we needed to have a really deep understanding of the captive marketplace. And did we want to start from scratch? Do we want to build our own, or utilize an existing captive, or partner with someone else in the space? So moving along the roadmap, we launched a national evaluation looking for the right solution, and ultimately decided that the W.R. Berkley company was the best partner to launch this with. Now, they are a Fortune 500 company. You may hear us refer to them as Berkley or Berkley Accident Health, but we'll get into more details about them later in the presentation. Along the roadmap, last month we had our phase 1 client launch to a smaller subset of employers, and now we're here at phase 2 client launch, where we're releasing this to the broader market. And so as we continue to refine our message and each of you start to understand the vision and the long-term value of the captive, the goal is really to get to the letter of intent stage by the end of the summer, and that's this LOI August 2020. Now, while the price and market competitiveness is definitely important, the captive solution is really designed to be a strategy where employers are locking arms with the idea of driving down costs over time. And so the letter of intent allows us to better understand who wants to be on board by the end of the summer as we push towards the go live and the launch in January 1st, 2021. Throughout today, we're going to cover 4 main areas, and we're going to keep it pretty high level as we go through them. First, we're going to cover the current healthcare challenges, and this probably won't be shocking to most of you. We're also going to review the stop-loss captive marketplace. Then we'll get into specifics about the WAYMARK Collective, and then go into details on the rollout and the next steps. So first, jumping into the health insurance landscape, we've all probably experienced enough insurance renewal meetings to have some level of common frustration with the insurance industry as a whole. There's really a lack of predictability, and as we think about planning and budgeting for our insurance costs, at times it can feel like a little bit of a crapshoot. And so the captive idea considers, what if there was a way to manage your health plan by reducing renewal volatility and ultimately capturing back the premium that isn't used? So when we use our premium or more than our premium, we're quickly asked to provide more. But what about in those years where we don't use it all? And capturing that back is what we're trying to achieve here with the WAYMARK Collective. So let's talk about a few ways that folks are insuring their health plans today. Again, this is pretty high level, and we've really distilled it down into two core principles: fully insured and self-insured. On the fully insured side, the employer pays a fixed monthly premium, and the carrier retains all the risk and all the profits. With that, you get limited flexibility, limited transparency, rate increases in bad and in good years, and lots of carrier change. Looking at the self-insured world, which I believe most employers online today probably are, in that arrangement, you're obviously paying the majority of the claims. You need stop loss for protection against large claims. You can benefit in good years, and you definitely get more flexibility and data transparency. However, there's still some volatile risk there, potential. Cash flow fluctuation can be an issue, and stop loss premium is gone even in those good years. So what if there was a better way to take on the benefits of self-insurance, but better manage that volatility and cash flow fluctuation? That's what we're getting at. So what we're trying to achieve here with the WAYMARK Collective is the following: improved renewal stability, cost control measures, data transparency, reduction in overall risk, predictability in your cost, and ultimately a return of premium in the event that we can outperform the market. So let's do a quick high-level review of the captive marketplace as well. And what we're going to do here with this illustration is string together a few key concepts, starting from the top and working our way down. So at the top, we have a captive, which is an alternative way to insure risk. It's an insurance company that is typically owned and controlled by its insureds. Then take that idea of the captive and consider the collective. And a collective is a group of insureds that work together in partnership to achieve a common goal. So that's really getting everyone together on the same page. And then the blend of the captive solution and the collective power of the organizations inside HORAN's client base, that's the WAYMARK Collective. And that joins like-minded employers to deliver superior cost outcomes by more aggressively managing risk, group purchasing stop loss, and sharing risk to reduce volatility. So it blends the best of the captive world and the collective whole under HORAN's leadership and guidance. To take that a step further, in this illustration, you're going to hear us talk a lot today about the mine, ours, and theirs concept. So with this illustration, starting from the bottom and working our way up, at the bottom you have the employer, each of you, and you still have the ability to select your own underlying health plan, your own benefit design, and select your own risk tolerance. You're also still responsible for paying your own claims as you would today in a normal self-funded arrangement. But in this, there becomes a threshold inside the captive layer where all employers are locking arms to share a certain layer of risk. And that's this middle layer that we're talking about, the WAYMARK Collective. And then, of course, over top, you have protection against catastrophic claims, which falls under the reinsurance layer. That's with Berkley, who I mentioned earlier. So in the event that there's a really large claim, it can be protected so it's not drown the whole captive. So that's the mine, ours, and theirs. And what we're going to talk about for the majority of today is how we're going to manage the middle layer of risk. And what's really great about this model is that it creates a winning environment for everyone who participates, and that ultimately benefits the employer. All those reasons that we talked about earlier are here on the left-hand side, and those are the reasons why the employer wins. So the renewal stability, cost control, data transparency, so on and so forth. That's why the employer wins. As we work on this graphic towards the bottom right with the carriers, they see a simplified administrative model that simplifies their underwriting and produces more volume. And so if you think about it, all the employers on the line, the carriers, they can try to compete individually one at a time after another to win your business, or the carriers can make a really aggressive play at the full group of employers, and that gives them more predictable claims risk, a better administrative model, and gives you, the employer, a better carrier marketplace. Because the carrier wants the whole collective. And then in the top right, in the blue there for HORAN, what this does is it helps us create more value for clients, offer more control, more transparency, and those ultimately result in better overall outcomes. And so with this captive marketplace, as we're digging in more and employers understand it better and the carriers understand it better, we realize that this concept isn't going anywhere, and we actually anticipate it to grow pretty rapidly. And in that same vein, private equity has recently gotten involved, and you know once their money comes in that the market can be really dynamic. So if you've ever heard or read Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, he talks about the flywheel and the flywheel effect. And so we've taken that concept and applied it to our model here with the WAYMARK Collective. So in this illustration, the far left side of the flywheel, that's the buildup. It's the buildup of the work. And then along the outside of that circle, you have the drivers on the outside of the wheel. And so getting that flywheel to start rotating is what produces a breakthrough. And what we're looking for in the WAYMARK Collective is to align clients who are committed to a couple different ideas here of managing costs, being engaged in their health plan, and ultimately aligning the behaviors that we know outperform employers who don't take those same steps. So the clients that are forward-thinking and disciplined in risk management, claims utilization, and optimizing costs, that starts the flywheel effect, and in the short term, creates some short-term gain. But over time, the intent here is that we get the flywheel spinning more rapidly, and we grow the volume by pairing you with more and more partners who are equally aligned on aggressively managing your risk. And so what that does is it takes a really attractive risk profile to the market with high volume and starts to produce a positive cash flow margin. Ultimately, if we can outperform the risk that the carriers are taking on and beat that premium, we can start to create enough margin to redistribute those dollars back to employers. That's the goal here. And so with that, we're going to talk about how this model is set up inside the WAYMARK Collective, and our good friend Leslie Miller is on to go into a little bit more of those details. Leslie, are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Colin.
Wonderful.
So thank you all for letting me join you today. And I just want to preface this by I am always happy when I hear Colin's voice on the other end of the phone, because he's going to be a new dad any minute. And I know he worked really hard to pull this together, and I was hoping that he was going to be able to join us today. So good job, Colin. So I was engaged by HORAN probably 6 months ago, if not more, to take a look at the captive marketplace for them, because they were receiving a lot of interest in captives from their clients, but they were handling it in a one-off situation. So they would have a client who might be ideally suited to look at a captive for renewal situation, and then they would look at a captive, and 6 months later they would look at another captive, and another team would look at another captive 3 weeks later. And we didn't have a real good way to go to market in a less than episodic way, but to go to market on behalf of HORAN and its clients and its book of business, and take a look at who might be the best solutions. So that was the assignment that I took on, which was to evaluate the marketplace to help HORAN make a determination of whether it was a build or buy scenario, to help the team understand how different versions of captives could best meet different client needs, and to move the whole conversation forward. So I surveyed the entire marketplace of captives, of which there are a lot, and I landed on 6 captive solutions that I looked at on behalf of HORAN and its clients in pretty good depth and detail. And here's what I learned when I looked at it through that lens. To join an existing captive was an easy thing to do, but it resulted in a lot of additional middlemen or middle people, all of whom added value, but all of whom needed to be paid for their services. And then, because captives were not designed for the HORAN book of business in particular, there are lots of duplication around tools and services and advice sort of things between the people who work for the captive and the account management team that has come to serve you so well over the years. And the issue became, when you got through that duplication and you got through paying off all of the additional middle people, and I'll tell you what they all do in a minute. They all serve a great purpose, but they all need to get paid. I found that in a lot of situations, those kinds of captives actually added more cost to an environment where you were looking for equal or less cost, not more cost. So at the end of the day, we looked at all of the existing captive solutions and we made a decision that they did not meet the best needs of the book of business. And then we went down what is the obvious path, which is if you don't get an existing captive, who builds captives? So I went and I talked to all of the captive managers. Again, there are many and they are good, but building a captive from scratch would have resulted in a fairly laborious and time-consuming process, just because of all of the filing and the Department of Insurance concerns, would have cost more money and would have saddled everybody with a greater financial burden than we felt was worth the return on that investment. So that was not a path that made sense. And clearly, where you go next is, who else is going to be in the captive space? So if we're not going to do a captive with a captive manager, who are we likely to do a captive with? Well, the next logical group of people to engage were third-party administrators, because you're going to be self-insured, and that means that you will need a TPA to manage your claims. And so we visited with all of the TPAs that serve the marketplace that you are in, and many of them have great captive solutions, but they come with restrictions because they are tailored to what the TPA can do, not necessarily what the client needs. So after we spent some time in the TPA world, we put that one on the side along with captive managers, and we said, what is the last stop for us if we want to come up with a single solution that works best for the HORAN book of business? And the last stop for us were the stop loss carriers. So we met with all the stop loss carriers to figure out the best way that we could work with them to develop a captive solution. And I'll let you in on a little secret. The stop loss carriers love captives, and they want to do whatever they can to help you move the proposition forward because they want to sell you stop loss. So from their perspective, it is very much a win-win situation. And so after we talked to a lot of the captive managers and the TPAs, we settled on stop loss partners, and we ultimately selected Berkley Accident Health. So if you're not familiar with Berkley, I want to take a couple of minutes to tell you how we got to that space. So Berkley, A+ rated, which is a big deal in the insurance industry. It means that you're a stand-up organization that has the financial wherewithal to take on risk, be in business, and pass a lot of the internal controls. They have been in the employee benefits stop loss business forever, and they've been in the captive stop loss business since it began, which is only 10 years ago. So I want to be really clear with you that employee benefit captives are a relatively new phenomenon, unlike the property and casualty world, which has been doing this forever. We borrow a lot of concepts from the property and casualty world, but they work very differently. So one of the things that kept us in the dialogue with Berkley was the whole idea that they have not only been in this since employee benefit captives came into the marketplace, they actually operate 30 captives as we speak. So while this is a new cell that would accommodate the HORAN book of business, this is not a new business venture for Berkley. And they have incredible experience, great partners, lots of good ideas, and have offered us a dedicated underwriting team, again, for the HORAN book of business. So lights out, they were the right solution. So let me tell you how this particular captive is structured. It's domiciled onshore in North Carolina. It is a segregated cell that is actually owned by Berkley. And I'm going to spend some time with you on ownership and why that's important for you to understand. In the captive world, in addition to the premium that you pay, you also post collateral every year. That's sort of like an individual reserve for every company participant. The collateral is returned to you annually. So Berkley does not keep collateral. HORAN does not keep collateral. The collateral is returned to you every year, and you just repost for the years that continue. Surplus, similarly, is distributed to active members annually. Berkley doesn't keep your surplus. HORAN doesn't keep your surplus. The surplus that you all generate from your good experience and good claims management is returned to the members of the captive, which I think is a critical feature. Next up, the WAYMARK Collective will establish a board of advisors instead of a board of directors. And I like to spend a couple minutes with you on that because I think this is a very big deal. Many captives talk to you about being on the board of directors, which causes you to become a shareholder of the company. So in order to join a captive, you have to buy shares of stock within that captive, makes you an owner, of course, gives you the liability that comes with ownership, both E&O, D&O, and fiduciary, and gives you stock that can only be sold back to the captive, to other captive members at what they determine as fair market value. So we looked at a lot of these captives and we determined what the best way was to structure it for the clients that were in need of it. And we settled on a scenario that says you don't have to be a shareholder. You do not have to buy stock. You can be a board of advisors, and we can allow Berkley to take all of the fiduciary risk. Our board of advisors will serve to guide us in a selection of service providers, whether that is TPAs or networks or technology or point solutions. That's what we're looking for the board of advisors to help us with, and to guide the future strategy of WAYMARK. And then the last piece of it is, for those of you who have heard about captives or are familiar with captives or use captives in other part of your business, you know that the captive industry is fraught with the annual big meeting, which is usually a quite lovely event in a quite lovely resort somewhere where you get to talk about your captive and make decisions about the next year's progress. So even though we're going to have a board of advisors, we will still have an annual meeting, and it will be in one of two locations. If we are all back to traveling and we are allowed to leave the country, we will join the Berkley Symposium in the Cayman Islands. And alternatively, if that doesn't work for our group, we will go to North Carolina and we will meet at the Department of Insurance administrative offices to have our annual meeting. So either way, you will come together once a year in some location to take care of the business of the captive. Okay, now I want to talk about who does what in a captive, because I think there's three key components that I would like everybody on this call to understand. And this is the stuff that's really important in the captive world. So HORAN is going to do all of the pre-underwriting, and the pre-underwriting they did is what caused you to be invited to participate in this call today. So they are always looking at your risk, examining claims, coming up with ideas to help you manage that better or differently, in addition to providing great day-to-day service through their account management teams. And ultimately, their job is to protect the integrity of the risk. Berkley provides the stop loss coverage. They provide a dedicated team to work with the HORAN teams to provide full and final underwriting. And at the end of the day, they assume all of the financial risk. So they are the deep pocket in the room. And I think that's a really important concept that I'm sure I'm going to get questions about during the Q&A. And then SRS, Strategic Risk Services, is the captive manager. And they are the business office to the captive. They handle compliance, they handle tax and accounting, audits, whatever additional professional services that we might need. And they make sure that money in and money out all lines up, that tax filings can be done in a timely and correct fashion. And they are there to answer any questions that we might have as it relates to insurance regulation. So all three of those people play a critical but different role in this organization.
All right. Thank you very much, Leslie. So now that we have some background on the players and the different parts here, we're going to show a little bit more about how the actual finances flow and how the claims are processed within the WAYMARK Collective. So here is a sample of how the WAYMARK Collective actually shares the risk. Starting from the bottom and working our way up, on the bottom, you have each employer represented by each of these bars. So you can see, starting from left and working right here, you have $50,000 specific deductible, $125,000 specific deductible, and so on and so forth as you move to the right. Each employer still retains your own underlying health plan, the flexibility for benefit designs, and pays the claims just like you would in a normal self-funded arrangement today. Now, once an employer has a claim that exceeds their specific stop-loss risk profile, is then shared in what's called a floating layer of risk. And that floating layer in the WAYMARK Collective is $225,000. That's the dark blue section is what we're talking about here when we're saying the shared risk profile. So you'll see that each employer actually shares equally in that portion, although only at their own tolerance. And what I mean by that is that each employer puts the same amount of stress on the shared layer. And that's because the premium, it's underwritten by Berkley, and each employer's premium is adequately adjusted to cover for their tolerance of risk. And so when you pay the premium, what you're actually paying for is the shared risk profile, the dark blue, and then the teal section for the reinsurance covered by Berkley. Taking this one step further here, let's look at an actual example of a claim and how that would work through the process here. So in this example, we have the employer on the left-hand side interested in joining the collective, but wants to keep a very low risk tolerance of $25,000 as their specific stop-loss deductible. So in the event of this $600,000 claim, keep in mind that mine, ours, and theirs concept. So the employer on the left-hand side would be responsible for the first $25,000, just as you are today. After that $25,000, the next $225,000 would be shared across the employers in the captive layer. That's that middle shared layer. And so that gets us to a total of $250,000 on this claim thus far. The next $350,000 would be passed to Berkley, the reinsurer, for anything over and above that captive layer. So this is the mechanism that really protects the captive from being destroyed by a large claim or two. Continuing to build on this, so here's an example where we have the individual employer purchasing stop loss versus the power of the WAYMARK Collective, and in this example containing 24 employers. So if I start at the bottom, in the current scenario, each employer is represented as its individual group going to market to buy stop loss, just as it's done today outside of the WAYMARK Collective. You pay your stop loss premium, and then at the end of the year, the expected distribution is $0. Now, with the example of 24 groups, if I move up to the gray, 24 groups inside the WAYMARK Collective, we've determined, using actual data, we've determined that the actual stop loss spend here is between $200,000 and $1.4 million for these groups. And so the combination of these 24 employers and bringing them together, that represents $16 million in aggregate premium spend. And then based on the performance of the collective, the 24 employers are then potentially eligible for a distribution at the end of the year. And because of that, that's why protecting the integrity of the risk and the profile of each client is so important to ensuring that we have clients that are aligned to taking actions that actually drive better claim results. The more that we can outperform the expected, the more we can redistribute to the clients in the WAYMARK Collective. So this is really that idea of we win and lose as one group.
This is Dominic here. I'll take this next slide. You know, to date, Colin and Leslie have done a great job in helping each of you kind of understand the power of the collective. Though, what's it mean to you? You know, each employer on the line is probably wondering, how much is this going to cost me, and how does this look compared to my current plan? The intent would be that each employer who wants to proceed to the next step would be provided an illustrative quote, and that illustrative quote would be based on your actual experience and your actual plan design, your TPA partners, et cetera. This is a sample of what an illustrative quote would look like. In this particular example, you're looking at an employer who has selected a $100,000 specific deductible. That makes their captive deductible with the floating layer $325,000. You still have the attachment point at 125% of expected costs. That's where Berkley reinsures. So just to kind of walk through what this diagram looks and covers, the green section there, the self-funded retention, that would be expected claims. So as you think about your current plan and how this might look when you get a quote, that green section represents what we anticipate your claim pick to be. The next item, which currently shows 0, is estimated TPA fees. I think it's important to reiterate, employers have flexibility here. So we're not forcing all the employers to pick the same TPA or to pick the same plan design, but we will help vet and understand who the most competitive TPAs are in the market, and whichever you decide, their fees would be inserted into the proposal there. The policy expenses, the $219,000, represent the yellow bar, which is Berkley's retained excess. So that coverage, the theirs coverage for catastrophic claims, we are still paying Berkley to reinsure that. And those dollars do go to Berkley without the intent of reimbursement. And for that, they cover catastrophic loss. The next layer, the captive layer, the dark blue, in this example, $310,000 of the $530 are pooled into the captive layer. This is where all of those employers are going to share that premium in risk across one another, with the intent that there's enough premium there to cover any claims in that corridor. And that's the first area, if there is excess premium at the end of the year, that there would be redistributions back to the employer. The last part, the non-premium funding, which Leslie talked a little bit as collateral, this is considered kind of like reserves. So the worst case scenario, if the collective has a bad year, that reserve layer is there to cover unexpected run against the corridor and would be the first portion returned in the event it's not used. The good news is, in a worst case scenario, your out-of-pocket costs are known. And so anything over and above that premium is ultimately Berkley's responsibility. And we like that because some captives can do and reserve the right to make a cash call. If the money is used and there's still more claims, they reserve the right to ask for an influx of cash from the members. The WAYMARK Collective does not work that way, and we have protected each of our clients with a known risk. Anything over and above that is Berkley's responsibility. So you'll see in this example, the claims cost at the bottom, the minimum cost of stop loss, the $219,000. We know that that is out the door to Berkley. And then the remainder is the premium that could be left to distribution based on performance.
All right. Thank you, Dominic. So again, as Dominic mentioned, if this is interesting to you, you will have the opportunity to get your own contingent quote that we can walk through with you, just like that. So moving on to the rollout and the next steps, just to level set on some of the requirements to get the WAYMARK Collective going, we must have at least 10 employers and 1,000 enrolled lives. And that's for the launch date of January 1st, 2021. You do have to have your health plan be self-funded. If you're online today and you're a fully insured health plan, we can work with you to help evaluate what that looks like to move from fully insured to self-funded. You also have to have a minimum of 50 employees enrolled in the health plan. And then obviously this is a stop loss play, so you must purchase the stop loss through the WAYMARK Collective. So right now, here's a condensed timeline, and right now we're still in the pre-launch phase. And so we are putting together those contingent quotes, continuing to do education for clients or anyone that wants to have a conversation about that. And then additionally, moving towards the end of the year as we get closer to September and October, we're working on that letter of intent. And so capturing that letter of intent allows your HORAN account team to put in the work that's needed to provide that stop loss quote around the September-October timeframe. And so keep in mind, while you're still buying a stop loss policy, you're also aligning to join the captive. And so that captive program has its own acceptance process, and your HORAN account team will also walk you through each step in joining the captive. So ultimately, we're looking on the far right side of the graphic here, we're looking to finalize all contracts and implementation in the fourth quarter of this year to ensure that your plan is ready to go by January 1st of 2021. And with that, that concludes the wrap of the presentation, and we want to jump into some of the questions and answers that the questions, excuse me, that have been submitted between the chat feature on the WebEx.
So we have a question here. If an employer joins and drops below 50 enrolled in the future, will that be a problem? The point of the 50 enrolled threshold is that participating employers are contributing enough premium to cover their risk. So, you know, the good news here is that Berkley is still ultimately responsible for the underwriting. I think it would be critical for Berkley to understand if that drop in enrollment is going to be consistent ongoing, or if there may be a likelihood that their enrollment increases again in the future. But over time, employers, in order to protect the risk and the integrity of the captive layer itself, does have to protect itself against employers who cannot contribute enough premium. So there's likely some flexibility there, but over time, it's critically necessary that employers have a minimum contribution.
So Dominic, it's Leslie, and I have a text here that wants to know why captives and why now. And so I'd like to spend a minute talking about that. So captives have, in the employee benefit space, they've been around for 10 years, and they started, as did most things, with really, really big employers. And it was really, really complicated because the Department of Labor had to approve you to become a captive. And a lot of the very large employers were putting things like life insurance and AD&D and those kinds of things in their captive because it was a predictable risk. It was actuarially sound, and they didn't want to pay premium to insurance companies. So over time, it's filtered down to the middle market, which is what we're talking about now. But let me tell you what's going on, because you all know this. The way we deliver healthcare is changing dramatically right now. And we know that this past year, we have seen a reduction in services. We've seen a reduction in services based on are just lost opportunity for healthcare spend, where they will re-emerge next year in the way of claims. We also know that people have moved willingly now to telemedicine. So the idea that you're going to actually go see a physician versus talk to a physician on the phone, totally going to change the cost basis of how healthcare is delivered. And the advantage of doing all of those kinds of things inside a captive is that you are self-insured and you are paying your claims as they happen. So if a telemedicine visit is half the price of an office visit and your people choose to do telemedicine, that's the way you're going to pay for that kind of program. So there's a real opportunity to capture savings in the next, let's call it 12 to 24 months, while the insurance company tries to sort all of this out. And the insurance industry will sort it out, and we need the insurance industry. But right now is a good opportunity for you to not have to pay for that sorting out while you're thinking about different and better ways to bring benefits to your employees.
I have another question here about the minimum enrollment, the 10 lives or 10 groups or 100,000 or 10 groups or 1,000 lives, and whether or not those are absolute requirements. You know, the intent, I would consider those kind of soft targets. The real value comes closer to the 1,000 lives versus the 10 employers. The value of the captive is having enough volume in it that you can absolutely share risk and create a more predictable profile. So it's probably more important to be closer to 1,000 lives than 10 groups specifically. But you also need other groups in there to have somebody to share with and across. So, you know, if it were 9 groups and 1,000 lives, that likely works. If it were 8 and 1,000 lives, that likely works. There does become a minimum threshold where you go, wait a minute, there's not other people in here to share with. So there's a little bit of flexibility there, but for all intents and purposes, we think that's kind of a safe starting number. I have one more question here. What does it require to get our contingent quote? As Colin mentioned, working through your HORAN account team would be the place to start. If you can just let them know that you're interested in pursuing the next step with the WAYMARK quote, we can work on gathering your current claim data and working with Berkley to get that illustrative quote to you. Their turnaround time is pretty quick. I don't have any other questions here. Leslie, are you getting any others?
Let me take a peek. Actually, I do have one question that came to me, which is sometimes captives are established around a vertical, right? So it's a captive insurance company for the trucking industry, or it's a captive insurance company for healthcare, or you know, some predefined vertical where similarly positioned businesses all come together in the captive with the idea that that risk looks a lot the same. We've actually structured this with the vertical being HORAN clients. And the reason for that is most of HORAN's clients have their headquarters and a large population of their employees in the Cincinnati marketplace. And then, of course, they are very national and large in scope, so they could have employees everywhere. But the idea is that because of that, there's a real intimacy around what clients are accustomed to and required to have a great client experience and a great employee experience. So the examples that I usually give when I'm in those kinds of conversations is, If you were to engage in a captive that was run by an organization somewhere else, they really might not understand the nature of Children's Hospital in Cincinnati and the idea that it is not likely, if your employees need Children's Hospital, that you're going to send them to Columbus, who has a great Children's Hospital, right? Because it feels like it's out of town and they're going to want to have their services locally. So it's this yin and yang around trying to be cost effective and manage risk, but make sure that both the clients and their employees are having a really great experience, and that the balance is that you pay the right amount of money for the right amount of services.
Leslie, one more question here about the commitment the employer needs to make to the captive. Is it annual, multi-year? And you might talk for a minute about the distribution of premium.
Got it. So joining a captive is a long-term play. There's no doubt about it, but your contract is annual. And we understand that things happen to businesses that might cause them to have to leave after the course of a year. Let's say that you're in some kind of an M&A situation and you are the company that has been acquired and you no longer have your own health plan. You would not be able to remain a member of the captive. So we understand that. But we would want people to approach joining the captive with the idea that this is a multi-year, and I always use 3 years as the benchmark, but that's not a very scientific benchmark. But you would want to be in it for a number of years. If you were to leave the captive, you would get a return of your collateral at the close of the policy year, and I'll talk about policy years in a second. But if you were to leave the captive and you were not an active member, the money that might have been due to you as a surplus distribution would stay within the captive and be distributed to the other members of the captive. So you have to be an active member of the captive to get your surplus return, but everybody gets their collateral back at the end of a policy year. And let's just talk about a policy year for just 1 second. This captive launches 1/1, so it's a 12-month 1/1, but people are going to have different appetites for stop loss policies, right? It could be a 12/12, it could be a 12/24, it could be 12/18, it could be any number of things. So at the close of the policy year, when the captive is no longer responsible for paying your run out claims, then we will go to settlement and return the money. And that could be in a variety of scenarios based on what you ultimately select for your stop loss coverage. I think I might have confused that. So Dominic, if that didn't sound like English, ask me again.
Essentially, I think to maybe clarify, the premium distribution happens 6 months following the close of the plan year. After the plan year ends, after run out is over, and after the books are settled. Leslie, one more question about if you're not currently a 1/1 renewal on your stop loss.
So Berkley can accommodate a couple months on either side of it. So they can either write a long contract or a short contract. And alternatively, you could, of course, depending on how you are structured, you could cancel a current stop loss arrangement and join the captive on January 1st, or you might decide, if you're already self-insured, to move your business to Berkley outside of the captive so that you can move it into the captive at the most appropriate date. So we have a little bit of flexibility, but not unlimited.
The last question, and then we'll wrap this up, was about the amount of collateral required, and that collateral is 20% of the captive layer, the corridor layer. So in that example we showed, the premium in that layer is $310,000, making the collateral 20% of that $62,000. We do intend to send this slide deck to everyone participating today, so you guys will get these slides after we wrap. Colin, you want to close out?
Yeah, thank you everyone for your attendance today and for the questions. As we mentioned, we're having individual conversations in the weeks to come, so please work that through your HORAN account team, and we look forward to providing more education as it comes out. And that concludes today. Thank you, everyone.